I never heard of the term born digital, so I asked Leslie on the phone, what does that mean? Tell us about born digital. What does it mean? And how does the archiving of born digital materials work?
Well, I mean, I think Henry's just
You told them what born digital means. So you should...
I mean, I think I explained that born digital documents never had a life outside.
Right, I want you to explain it to the audience. I got it the first time.
Never had a, is this a term that's not, do you guys, have you heard this term before? No.
Has anyone heard the term, who has heard the term born digital? Okay.
Interesting.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
So
Okay.
most people have not.
Yeah, it's a document or a document that has been born or created entirely electronically, and therefore it's not a sheet of paper that someone wrote that you scan into a computer. It was created.
Well, would that
on a
include
computer.
things like web videos?
Yes, absolutely. Websites, any of these sorts of any software program ever created, right? I mean, these things are all created initially in ones and zeros. So how do you, I mean, this to me is a super interesting question. Again, I have to defer to Henry because he's been thinking about it for so long, but when you think now, I mean, the beauty of paper is that we know that we're going to be able to read this, assuming literacy rates don't plummet, even further for well into the future. But when you think about any sort of, I mean, even if you think about something like old records, something that is well within our memories, it's easy to imagine that in another 100 years, it's going to be very difficult to extract the contents of that in a way that someone would be able to usefully use them. And so this has been a huge issue that Stanford's worked at in partnership with the Library of Congress, right?
Yeah, we've worked with a number of partner institutions on different projects. The history of, there are two very closely related preservation issues here. One is the preservation of software and the other is the preservation of born digital documentation. And they're very closely related because if you think about it, most documents require some kind of software in order to render them, right? So it's kind of interesting. This is an aside and I apologize for rambling, but there's a recent requirement that federally funded grants to a place like Stanford are now requiring researchers to develop a plan for the long-term archiving of the data that's collected as part of that research project. However, there is not a requirement to save any of the software that's used to render the data.
Interesting.
Kind of interesting, right?
Wow.
Well, anyway, we work on both of those. We have collections of software and we have collections of documentation. So, computer games is software, email is documentation, all of that. And at the moment, we have 3 projects running, different funded projects that we're running, partly as research, partly as development, and partly as archival practice. And we have been involved in various projects now. I mean, the first software preservation conference I went to was in 1990, so we've been involved in this for quite some time. It's been interesting. I mean, the general outline of it is when we get something, if you give us something on any kind of medium, if it's a computer game that you bought or a WordStar program, or if it's the hard drive from your computer, it's a certain bet these days that the thing you gave us, the format in which you were saving it, is essentially going to be thrown away pretty soon after we get it. So we're developing techniques for migrating the data to our digital repository. And then we also have to worry about things like how are we going to describe what's there, cataloging, or how are we going to make it searchable, and finally, how are we going to provide access to it? So, okay, we have software packages, say from the DOS era, sitting in our archive, and somebody comes to us 50 years from now and says they'd like to run the version 2 of Microsoft Word or something like that. How's that going to happen? What will that transaction look like? And what are the different use cases for that? How about, I'm sure a lot of you know about things like virtual worlds, Second Life, things like that, environments that people spend a good deal of their time in some cases. What's the scenario for that use case? How will we, many years from now, when those virtual worlds are dead, closed?
I haven't heard much
what will we
about the
do?
virtual worlds and virtual reality. Is it still alive?
Well, Second Life is still around, for one.
don't hear about it
Game
very
worlds, certainly. The many game worlds are still around. There are virtual reality is an interesting story because with Oculus Rift in the last year or two, we've seen a resurrection of the dream of virtual reality. I'm not sure I would go so far as to say we've seen the
But these kinds of
realization that dream
intangible
yet.
things, whether it's software or email or web videos or virtual reality, it would seem very, very hard to document.
It is hard, and part of it is an idea that is quite commonplace, that digital means infinitely copyable in a perfect way. That digital, if something is digital, it can be stored and reproduced perfectly. So that, for example, an experience in a virtual world, because it's all bits in some sense or another, could just be captured and re-rendered sometime in the future. Well, it turns out it's a lot more complicated than that, because those ideas about software replication don't tell you very much about what people were doing in those spaces. And so you end up having to think about the different kinds of documentation that are available to tell you what people are actually doing, not just what it's like, what the software looks like when you render it, what the space that people were in look like, but what were people actually doing. And to do that, you really have to think back to what traditional archival work is like in the real world. It might be that the best documentation of an activity in a virtual world like Second Life might be a blog of somebody who's telling you about the stuff that they did, essentially written documentation about what happened. It might be a video capture of something a political demonstration in Second Life or something like that. It may not really be that useful in some cases.
Yeah, it might be
to focus
secondhand
on
information.
software.
Might be secondhand, and that not a true
Yeah.
real-life experience that you could witness for yourself.
Yeah, and the point I'm trying to make is that it's actually quite diverse, the various kinds of documentation that you end up finding useful and thinking about preserving, each of which has its own problems in terms of preservation. Video has different problems from
sure.
text, has different problems from software. But we have to run the gamut of all of those activities if we want to be able to claim that 50 years from now we'll be able to give people a reasonable approximation of what was going on in the use of software and in the inhabitation of these virtual worlds and other things that were happening now. We're going to have to do basically all of those things in order to answer the kinds of questions historians will have decades from now.
Thanks, Henry.